Hello friends. Before we start the video, I really need your support. The channel is going through a tough time and your help would mean a lot. If you're watching this video right now, please hit the like button, leave any comment, and support the video. If everyone watching does this, it would really help me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. My name is Coda Reeves, and I've been working as a wilderness ranger for 14 years. When the posting came through for Glacier National Park's remote Upper Lake Station, I saw it as an opportunity. The previous ranger had left after 8 months, and before that the position had been vacant for almost a year. Most people in the service knew why. I told myself I didn't care about the rumors. I told myself I was strong enough not to be affected by whatever folklore had grown up around that place. I was wrong about both those things. The job posting didn't explain why the position had such high turnover. The official report cited personal reasons for the previous ranger's departure. The one before that had transferred to the East Coast without explanation. There was a 3-year gap where the position apparently wasn't even offered. Then it returned, and nobody applied for 6 months. When I did, my supervisor asked me twice if I understood what I was signing up for. I said yes, though I didn't. Not really. The reason I accepted was simple and embarrassing. I needed distance from a life that had become suffocating. A marriage that had died slowly like a tree starved of water. A career that had plateaued in a way that made every day feel like repetition of the previous day. A city apartment where the walls were beige and the windows looked out on other buildings, and I'd started to feel like I was disappearing into the monotony. The Upper Lake Station promised solitude. It promised wilderness. It promised me a chance to become someone different. The cabin sits at the edge of Upper Lake, one of Glacier's larger alpine lakes, positioned on the eastern shore where the forest meets the water. The station itself covers about 12,000 acres of protected wilderness, my responsibility, my domain. The nearest town is 45 minutes away by vehicle, and the road becomes impassable in winter. The nearest ranger station is 18 miles south, and radio communication is spotty depending on weather and atmospheric conditions. I arrived in late March, as the snow was beginning to break up in the lower elevations. The cabin itself is solid, built in 1978. Maintained adequately, if not lovingly. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small office space, a generator that works, a radio system that mostly functions, and a propane stove that heats the main room. There's a dock that extends into the lake, and a boat for emergency water access. There's a report file that goes back decades, previous rangers documenting wildlife observations, maintenance issues, and occasionally, stranger things. I should have read those files more carefully. The first 2 weeks were quiet. I settled in, organized the equipment, and familiarized myself with the territory. The lake itself is beautiful in a way that photographs don't capture. The water is deep blue-green, so clear you can see down 15 feet in some places. The mountains rise sharp and dramatic on the western side. The forest around the cabin is a mix of pine and aspen, dense enough to provide privacy, but with clearings that allow sightlines to the lake and the tree line beyond. The wildlife was sparse in early spring, that made sense. The animals hadn't fully emerged from winter yet. I saw some elk in the distance, moving away from me. A few birds, starting their seasonal return, some tracks in the remaining snow patches. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed exactly like what a ranger should expect. That's the thing about the place. It looked normal. The danger wasn't obvious. It didn't announce itself. The deer appeared on April 11th, a Friday morning. I remember the date because I was planning the weekly supply run to town, and I wanted to go that afternoon. I saw it from the kitchen window while making coffee. It was standing at the edge of the lake, about 40 yards from the cabin. That part wasn't unusual. Mule deer are common in Glacier, and seeing them near the water is normal behavior. What was wrong was harder to articulate. The stance was off. The posture suggested the animal was balanced too carefully, as if the legs underneath it didn't quite belong to that body. The head was tilted at an angle that no cervid should be capable of maintaining. Not a natural curiosity, but a mechanical rotation, like something was working the joints without understanding their proper range. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds before it bolted, moving away from the lake with a gait that was almost jointed, legs moving in coordination that seemed slightly unsynchronized. It disappeared into the trees and I stood at the window holding my coffee mug, thinking that I'd witnessed something that didn't quite fit into the natural world, though I couldn't articulate why. I didn't write about it in the log that day. It seemed too vague, too subjective. How do you report that a deer moved in a way that felt wrong? The supply run that afternoon was uneventful. The town, a place called Glacier Junction, is a small tourist hub that exists mainly to service the park. There's a grocery store, a diner, a gas station, and a lodge. The people are friendly in that professional way that hospitality workers develop. Nobody warned me about anything, nobody mentioned the previous rangers or why the position had been difficult to fill. I returned to the cabin as the sun was setting. The lake was calm, the forest quiet. Everything was beautiful and peaceful in that way that Glacier can be during the shoulder seasons when the tourists haven't arrived yet and the place feels like it belongs only to the land and the creatures that live on it. I spent the evening reviewing the old ranger logs, the ones kept in filing cabinets in the office space. That's when I should have paid closer attention. The entries from 2015 contain notations about unusual deer behavior. A ranger named Morrison had written about observing mule deer moving in patterns that suggested non-standard locomotion. He'd added a note: "These don't move like normal animals. Something is wrong with how they coordinate movement." The entries from the following year, by a different ranger, whose name was unclear in the handwriting, escalated. "The deer are wrong. I've confirmed it. They move as if something is using them, as if they're puppets with strings attached. Recommend investigation into parasitic or disease vector." That entry was followed by a 2-month gap in documentation. When entries resumed, they were brief and clinical. The ranger lasted another 6 months before transferring. The entries from 2017 were worse. A ranger named Hutchins had written detailed descriptions of observing entities that resembled deer but lack proper anatomical function. He'd noted that on 2 occasions these creatures had approached the cabin during daylight hours. One entry described how the thing had stood at the kitchen window, the same window where I'd seen the strange deer, and that Hutchins had felt observed in a way that suggested intelligence behind the observation. The entries became sporadic, and then they stopped entirely. A note in the margin, added later by administrative staff, indicated that Hutchins had taken medical leave and never returned. I closed the file and sat in the darkness of the cabin, listening to the wind in the trees and the small sounds that a building makes when it settles. I told myself that the previous rangers were unreliable witnesses, that they'd become isolated and their perceptions had distorted. That's what isolation does to some people. I wasn't going to let it happen to me. I was stronger than that. The next morning, I found deer tracks around the entire cabin perimeter. They formed a complete circle, as if something had walked the entire boundary of my living space during the night. The tracks were wrong in a way I couldn't fully articulate. The spacing was irregular, sometimes suggesting bipedal movement, sometimes quadrupedal. They would start going one direction and then reverse, heading back the way they'd come. Some sections showed what looked like dragging, as if something had fallen and then recovered. I took photographs. I documented the observations. I tried to write a report that sounded reasonable and failed. How could I explain that I was frightened by a set of tracks? That night I heard the sounds. They came from the forest beyond the lake, starting around midnight. The sound of something moving through underbrush, crashing through brush, no attempt at stealth or caution. The sounds weren't consistent. They'd be loud, then quiet, then loud again. They seemed to be moving in a pattern, circling something, or searching. The sounds stopped at the lake's edge. I heard the water splashing, movement in the lake, the sound of something large moving through the water with desperation or fury or hunger. It lasted maybe 5 minutes, and then silence. A silence so complete that it felt like something had died, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with every light on, with the rifle from the closet across my lap, and I listened to the darkness outside, understanding with a clarity that bypassed rational analysis that I was not alone in this place, and that whatever shared the forest with me did not have my best interests in mind. Morning came gray and cold. I looked at the lake, trying to see if anything was different. The water was calm, reflecting the overcast sky. There were no bodies, no evidence of the disturbance from the night before. It was as if nothing had happened, but the forest remembered. I could feel it in the way the birds didn't sing, in the absence of normal animal sounds. Something had happened, and the forest knew it. I called the main station and requested an emergency check. I didn't explain why. Renee, the supervisor, said someone would be out in 2 days. That was the fastest they could manage. 2 days suddenly felt like a very long time. The ranger who arrived was named Kovac, a man in his early 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in outdoor work. He examined the tracks with professional interest and made non-committal sounds. He checked the cabin for signs of break-in or disturbance. He looked for evidence of predator activity. Everything he did suggested he was going through the motions of an investigation he didn't really believe in. Probably just wildlife, he said, standing in the kitchen with coffee I'd made. Deer can act strange, especially if there's something off with their hormones or if they're sick. The circling behavior could be territorial, or it could be a predator, wolf maybe, following a wounded animal. There are no wolves in this region, I said. Not officially, Kovac replied, but they've been spotted moving back into Glacier over the last few years. Young males exploring new territory. It's possible. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that the tracks didn't suggest predator behavior, that they suggested something far more deliberate and wrong. But I could see in Kovac's expression that he'd already categorized my concern as the anxiety of an isolated ranger. He'd probably seen it before. The isolation gets to people in ways they don't expect. He left after checking the radio system and making sure the cabin was properly stocked. He told me to call if there were actual signs of danger, predator aggression, break-in, injury. Wildlife that behaved strangely didn't qualify. After he left, I felt more isolated than before. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they weren't distant. They were closer, louder, and more deliberate. I heard movement at the far edge of the clearing, sounds that suggested something large pushing through the forest. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. In the darkness, I could see shapes at the tree line. Large shapes, deer-sized, but moving in ways that made my stomach turn. They moved with an uncoordinated gait, limbs seeming to move independently, as if separate creatures were trying to operate a single body. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more in the darkness I couldn't penetrate. They stood at the edge of the clearing for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, and in that time I became certain of something. They were waiting to see if I would emerge, waiting to see if I would give them an opportunity. I stayed inside. I kept the lights on. I kept the rifle ready, and I watched. Around 2 a.m., they left. They moved back into the forest with the same coordinated wrongness, disappearing into the darkness like something dissolving into sleep. The next day, I found something new. On the dock, there was a message. Not written, but arranged. Stones had been placed in a pattern on the weathered wood. The pattern formed a shape that was almost a symbol, almost letters. Almost something that was trying to be language but couldn't quite achieve it. I photographed it and then scattered the stones, my hands shaking. The logs from previous rangers had mentioned similar incidents. A rock arrangement found near the cabin. Branches arranged in specific patterns near the water. One entry from 2016 mentioned finding patterns arranged by something that understands composition but not human meaning. The ranger who'd written that had included a hypothesis. Whatever these creatures are, they're attempting communication. They're trying to make us understand something, but the framework they're using is alien to human cognition. That night, I heard splashing at the dock. I went to the window and saw them in the moonlight. The not deer standing at the end of the dock. Their bodies contorted in ways that suggested their joints operated differently than they should. They weren't attacking the dock. They were standing on it, looking back toward the cabin, and I had the sickening certainty that they were looking at me. That they could see through the darkness and the window to where I stood watching. One of them tilted its head at that wrong angle, rotating it in a way that made my vision blur. When it moved its head back, I felt something like recognition cross between us, like an understanding had been reached. They left the dock and entered the water, moving with that same uncoordinated motion, and the water accepted them like they belonged there, like the lake recognized their strangeness. I didn't call the station. I knew what would happen. Another ranger would come, find nothing, and report me as unreliable. Or worse, nobody would come, and I'd be alone here knowing that the only people who might believe me had decided I was having a mental crisis. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every sighting, every sound, every arrangement of objects. I began to see a pattern in their behavior. They were trying to establish a pattern of interaction. They were trying to teach me something. They were preparing me for something. The entries in the old logs suggested that the previous rangers had eventually become convinced that the creatures weren't trying to harm them, not directly. The entities seemed to be studying their human observers, trying to understand them, trying to find some form of communication. One ranger had written, "I believe they're trying to initiate contact. I don't think they understand how to do it in a way that doesn't terrify us. I think they're as confused about how to communicate with humans as we are about communicating with them." By the end of that ranger's tenure, the tone had shifted. The observations became less clinical and more personal. I don't know if I'm frightened anymore. I think I'm curious. I want to understand what they want from me. That ranger had left abruptly, transferred away, and never worked for the Park Service again. By May, the creatures had become routine. They appeared nearly every night. The sounds of movement in the forest became background noise. The arrangements of objects appeared every few days. I began to anticipate their patterns. I began to watch for them. Worse, I began to want them to appear. The isolation was becoming less about solitude and more about separation. The only living things that acknowledged my presence were the not deer. Everyone else, Renee, the townspeople, even Kovac, seemed to exist in a different reality, one where my concerns were irrelevant and my sanity was questionable. The creatures, at least, recognized that I existed. They recognized something about me that made me important enough to study. I started leaving the cabin door unlocked at night. The months of June and July blurred together in a way I don't entirely understand. My documentation became sporadic. The ranger logs, my logs, contain entries that read like the work of someone slipping into obsession. Looking back, I can see it clearly. I was losing perspective. The isolation and the creatures were creating a feedback loop that was breaking my grip on rational assessment. But at the time, it felt like understanding. It felt like enlightenment. The creatures began to enter the cabin in early June. I knew they were coming, could feel the shift in pressure that preceded their arrival. I would wake to find them standing in the darkness of the rooms, their bodies too tall for the spaces, their heads tilted at those wrong angles, observing me with an intensity that suggested cognition far beyond what a deer should possess. I didn't resist. I didn't lock the doors again. I simply lay still and accepted their presence, and they would stand there for hours studying me, and I would study them back. We existed in a strange mutual examination, predator and prey in a relationship that had somehow inverted itself into something else entirely. Their movements became clearer as summer progressed. I began to understand that what I had interpreted as damage or wrongness in their anatomies was actually difference in construction. They weren't broken. They were built differently. The way their limbs moved, the way their heads articulated, the way they existed in space, it all suggested a biology that didn't match terrestrial mammalian design. They were wearing the shape of deer the way a person might wear clothes. The realization should have terrified me. It did at first, but terror gives way to other responses with prolonged exposure. Terror gives way to familiarity. Familiarity gives way to acceptance. By July, I'd stopped reporting to the station. I ignored the radio calls asking for check-ins. I ignored the increasingly urgent messages from Renee asking if I was functioning properly. I ignored an actual visit from Kovac in mid-July where he found me haggard, unwashed, and clearly having slept in my clothes for days. Kovac tried to convince me to come with him. He said I needed rest, proper food, human contact. He said the isolation was getting to me. He said he could arrange a transfer, medical leave, whatever I needed. I refused. I couldn't leave. The creatures needed me here. Or I needed the creatures here. The distinction had blurred into irrelevance. After Kovac left, and I saw the disappointment and concern in his eyes as he drove away, I sat on the dock and waited for nightfall. The creatures came earlier that night, before the sun had fully set. They emerged from the forest with more confidence than before, moving not furtively but with purpose. There were more of them than usual. I counted at least 7. They approached the dock, and for the first time I didn't retreat inside. I remained sitting on the weathered wood, my feet dangling over the water, and they surrounded me in a loose circle. Up close, the wrongness of their construction was even more apparent. The way the skin seemed slightly loose on the frame, the way the eyes didn't quite align properly. The way the joints were positioned just wrong enough to suggest they were articulated by something that understood anatomy but couldn't quite execute it perfectly. They were approximations of deer created by something that had studied the shape but not the underlying structure. One approached closer than the others. It extended its head toward me. That head that was too long and articulated too many ways. Its mouth opened and a sound emerged that was almost words. Not English, but phonetic, shaped by something trying to reproduce human speech with an instrument that wasn't designed for it. The word or approximation of language repeated several times. The other creatures made similar sounds, attempting the same phoneme, practicing, refining. They were trying to communicate. They had selected a target language, human speech, and were working to reproduce it. They were trying to speak to me. I should have been horrified, should have run, should have called for help. Instead, I was moved by something I couldn't articulate. By the effort they were making, by the clear attempt at bridging a gap between their kind and mine, by the recognition that they were trying, despite everything, to communicate rather than simply take what they needed. "I'm here," I told them. My voice was hoarse from disuse. "I'm here and I understand. Keep trying." The creatures made their sounds in response, perhaps interpreting my words as encouragement, perhaps understanding something in my tone that suggested acceptance. That night, They didn't leave. For the first time, they remained in and around the cabin through the entire darkness. I moved through my home and encountered them constantly. In the kitchen, standing on hind legs, studying the objects there with what seemed like curiosity. In the hallway, their bodies too long for the space, their heads touching the ceiling. In the bedroom, surrounding the bed, watching me as I lay there, not sleeping, not afraid, just existing in their presence. They seemed to be learning the space, cataloging it, understanding it. Toward dawn, one of them approached the bed where I lay. It lowered its head, those wrong eyes focusing on me with an intensity that transcended animal behavior. Its mouth moved, and the sounds that came out were closer this time, recognizable, almost English. Why, it attempted. Then again refining. Why, here, you. The effort involved in producing those words seemed to drain something from the creature. It retreated, and the others followed, melting back into the forest as the light began to touch the eastern mountains. I lay there as the sun rose, understanding that something fundamental had changed. They had crossed a threshold. They had moved from observation to direct contact, from study to interaction. The message on the dock reappeared that morning, but different. The stones formed letters. Not perfect, but recognizable. They spelled out a single word: stay. The radio finally fell silent around August 15th. I didn't turn it off. It simply stopped receiving transmissions. Renee's last message, left on the 10th, indicated that a proper ranger would be sent to replace me immediately. The tone was no longer concerned about my welfare. It was professional, bureaucratic. It was the tone of someone handling an administrative problem. But no ranger came. By that point, I don't know if I would have left if they had. The creatures had become as much a part of my daily existence as breathing. They appeared regularly. They moved through the cabin with increasing confidence, and they continued their attempts at communication, slowly improving their approximation of human speech. By August, they could form simple sentences. You stay, they would say. We learn. We come from far, another would manage. We study everything. This shape, one struggled with the words. Not comfortable. Hard to keep together. Help us. That last request, more than anything else, clarified my situation. They weren't here to harm me. They were here to learn from me. They had chosen this place, this lake, this cabin because of the ranger, because of me, and they needed my cooperation to understand the shape they were wearing, the form of reality they were trying to inhabit. I began to teach them. It started with simple things: how to move in ways that looked natural, how to coordinate the limbs properly, how to make the eyes focus in a way that wouldn't immediately signal wrongness to a human observer. I showed them how deer actually moved, through observations made from the dock, through descriptions of animal behavior, through demonstration of what natural looked like as opposed to their constructed approximation. In return, they gave me information, fragments of what they were, where they came from, why they had arrived in this remote place. They called themselves something that translated roughly as the observers. They were not aliens, not in the science fiction sense. They were something older, something that had existence in ways that reality usually didn't accommodate. They lived in spaces between, in moments that humans didn't normally perceive. They had developed the ability to press themselves into reality, to take shapes, to exist in ways that approximated physicality. But the shapes were difficult. The rules of this reality were constraining. The forms they took were uncomfortable, like wearing clothes made of concrete. They had chosen Upper Lake, they explained, because something about the geology and the isolation made it easier to exist here. The mountains created pockets of reality that were slightly more flexible. The distance from human civilization meant fewer witnesses to their imperfect approximations, and they had noticed me because I was alone, because isolation made humans more permeable to their presence, because my loneliness created a space that their existence could occupy. We didn't take you, they explained in late August, their speech becoming clearer with practice. We found you. You were always leaving space. Space for something else to exist. We filled the space. I understood what they meant. The marriage had created a void. The career had created emptiness. The isolation had carved out a hole in my existence that needed filling. And the creatures had come because the space was open and waiting. What do you want? I asked them one night. We were sitting on the dock together, me and 4 of them, their shapes becoming incrementally more natural as their understanding of the form improved. To understand how to stay, one replied. To exist in your reality without damage. To learn the rules that you follow. To become part of the pattern that permits stable existence here. And then, I asked, there was a pause. The creatures made sounds to each other, their language more complex than what they shared with me. Finally, one turned to me and produced words that had been so carefully crafted that I understood they represented something important, something they had been working toward saying. Then, maybe others come. If we succeed. If we can exist properly. If we can teach others to take shapes that don't hurt. If we can live here alongside you. The implication was clear. This was a test. I was part of an evaluation. If the creatures could successfully inhabit this reality, could learn to move through it without breaking it, could pass as natural to human observers, then others of their kind would follow. I would be a bridge between worlds. I should have been appalled. I should have understood that I was facilitating an invasion, a colonization, the beginning of something that would change everything. But I was lonely. And they had filled the loneliness with presence and purpose and attention. They cared what I thought. They learned my language. They valued my existence enough to study it, to understand it, to build their comprehension of reality around what I could teach them. I'll help you, I said. The creatures made sounds that might have been satisfaction or agreement, or perhaps their version of gratitude. By September, the creatures had almost perfected the form. Their movements were natural. Their eyes tracked with the proper focal range. Their coordination was nearly flawless. They could pass, I thought, as ordinary deer to a casual observer. Maybe even to a careful one if the light was right and the observer didn't spend too long looking. One morning in early September, I woke to find them gone. Not just from the cabin, from the entire area. The forest was silent. The dock was empty. The lake reflected the gray sky without disturbance. I walked the perimeter of the property, calling for them, and found nothing. At the tree line, I discovered a message. The stones had been arranged into a new pattern. This one was clearer than the previous attempts at language. It was a symbol, a gate or doorway, a passage, and beneath it, in letters made of small stones, a single word, soon. I understood. They had learned what they came to learn. They had achieved the form. Now they were preparing for the next phase. Now they were gathering others, or spreading the knowledge, or building the infrastructure for what would come next. I was to remain and wait. The choice I'd made, to help them, to teach them, had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. I sat on the dock as the sun set, watching the lake, understanding that the peaceful isolation I'd sought had been replaced with a different kind of isolation. I was no longer alone, but I was no longer connected to the human world either. I was alone with what I'd invited in. September 28th. The first one arrived during the day. It was standing in the clearing when I woke up. Not hidden in the forest. Standing openly in the morning light. A mule deer, perfect in every way except for the eyes. The eyes were wrong. They saw too much, understood too much, held too much consciousness behind them. I knew immediately it was one of the visitors, one that had learned the form so completely that it could move through the park without raising alarms. Over the next week, they arrived in increasing numbers. Not the ones I'd been teaching. They remained absent, perhaps moved on, perhaps waiting in the spaces between for their moment. But others, new ones, ones that had learned the form from the ones I'd taught, taking the lessons through whatever network of understanding they possessed and refining them further. I watched them from the cabin. They moved through the forest like normal wildlife. They appeared at the lake's edge like natural inhabitants. To an untrained eye, they would be invisible, just part of the forest's population. But I could see them. I could see the wrongness in how their joints articulated. I could see the precision in their movements that no wild animal possessed. I could see them watching the cabin, watching me, with the patient attention of something working toward a goal. On October 2nd, I finally made a decision. I had to warn someone. I had to try at least to communicate what I'd set in motion. I repaired the radio using components I found in the storage shed, and I made a call. Kovac answered. "I need to talk to you about Upper Lake," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, hoarse from disuse. "I need to explain what's happening here." There was a pause. Then Kovac replied, his voice careful. "Koda, we've been trying to reach you for over a month. Renee ordered your medical evaluation. I'm coming up there to bring you down for assessment." "No," I said. "You don't understand. I need you to listen. There are things in the forest, not normal animals. They're learning to look like deer, but there's something else. Something intelligent. Something that's preparing for something larger." Another pause, longer this time. "Koda, stay in the cabin. Lock the doors. I'm coming up there right now. Don't do anything until I arrive." I heard the concern in his voice. I knew what he thought. Another isolated ranger losing grip on reality. Another person broken by the solitude. Another casualty of Upper Lake. "It's not what you think," I said. I haven't lost my mind. I know how this sounds, but don't talk, Kovac interrupted. Just stay inside. I'm 30 minutes away. I hung up the radio. I looked at the cabin around me, the scratches on the door frames where the creatures had tested the boundaries, the arrangements of objects they'd left behind, the patterns they'd tried to teach me. I had to make a choice. I could let Kovac take me away, could be processed through whatever medical evaluation they decided was necessary, could try to make someone understand what I'd witnessed, or I could stay. The creatures arrived at dusk, flowing from the forest like water finding its level. Dozens of them, maybe more. They moved with perfect coordination, perfect naturalness, perfect wrongness. They surrounded the cabin, not aggressively but with clear intent. The one at the forefront approached the door. It raised a hoof and knocked, a sound that was deliberately human-like, deliberately designed to communicate purpose and intelligence. I opened the door. "We are ready," it said. The words were perfect English now. The accent was barely noticeable. "We have learned. We have spread the knowledge. Soon many more will take the shape. Soon we will be part of your forest naturally, without pretense. The ranger is coming," I told them. "Kovac, he'll see you." "Yes," the creature said. Its eyes were deep, dark, and ancient. "That is necessary. He must see, he must report. Others must know that the transformation is happening. Others must understand that resistance is not useful. We will exist here whether you help or not. But it is better if you help. It is better if humans accept what is coming." I looked past the creature, saw dozens of near-perfect deer arranged in the clearing, saw how they coordinated their movements, how they focused their attention with the precision of trained soldiers or scientists or explorers preparing for contact. In the distance, I heard a vehicle approaching. Kovac would arrive in minutes. He would see what I had created. He would report it. The knowledge would spread, exactly as the creatures intended. "What happens to me?" I asked. "You stay," the creature said. "You teach the new arrivals. You help them refine the form. You help them understand how to exist in human society, how to interact without raising suspicion. You become the bridge between the forest and the towns, between what we are and what you are." "And if I refuse?" The creature tilted its head, that familiar wrongness of motion that still had the power to make my stomach turn. "Then you leave," it said, "and we continue without you. But I think you will stay. The emptiness in you is not yet filled. We offer more than solitude, we offer purpose." The creature was right. Kovac's vehicle was audible now, maybe 10 minutes away. I could walk out to the road, could signal him, could attempt to explain, could try to be rescued, or I could stay in the cabin, in the forest, with the creatures that had filled my isolation with presence and meaning, even if that meaning was terrifying. I made my choice. I stepped back inside and closed the door as the creatures settled into the clearing, arranging themselves in configurations that would look natural to a human observer. A small herd, gathered near the lake, nothing unusual about them at all. Kovac arrived as the last light faded from the sky. I saw his vehicle headlights through the trees, saw him get out with a flashlight, saw him approach the cabin carefully. He looked at the creatures in the clearing. His flashlight beam played across them. In the darkness, in the limited light, they looked almost normal. But not quite. Even through the window, I could see him noticing something wrong. Some quality about their stillness, their coordination, their attention. He raised the radio on his belt, and I heard his voice, distorted by static, reporting that he'd arrived at the station, that everything looked normal, that the ranger was probably just having a rough time and needed rest. He didn't mention the deer. He didn't mention what he'd seen in their eyes, or maybe he had seen nothing at all. Maybe the creatures had already refined the form enough that to human senses they were indistinguishable from normal wildlife. Maybe the transformation was already complete. Kovac walked past the clearing without stopping. He approached the cabin and knocked on the door. I didn't answer. Instead, I moved to the back room and waited. He knocked again, called my name, and when I didn't respond, he radioed that I was apparently unable or unwilling to answer, that he would return to base and coordinate a more formal evaluation. I heard his vehicle leave, the sound of the engine fading into the night. The creatures settled outside the cabin, and I settled inside, and we waited together for whatever came next. In the morning, I would begin teaching the new arrivals. I would help them refine the form. I would prepare them for the moment when they would move beyond Upper Lake, beyond the mountains, toward the towns at the edges of the park. The towns beyond, the world beyond. The bridge had been built, and I was its foundation. My loneliness had opened the door, and I had invited in something that would remake the forest and perhaps remake everything that followed. I don't regret it, though I know I should. The creatures fill the spaces that humans left empty. They learn from me. They teach me in return. And the world beyond the mountains is slowly becoming aware that something has changed, that something is no longer quite right with the wildlife, that the rules of nature are being rewritten by something that understands them better than we ever did. Kovac will file a report, others will investigate. Eventually they'll find evidence of something unusual, something that doesn't fit standard wildlife behavior. But by then it will be too late to stop. By then, the forest will have already begun the work of transformation. By then, the creatures will have become so perfectly adapted to the form that no one will notice the wrongness except in brief, easily rationalized moments. And I will remain here, in the cabin by the lake, teaching and learning, existing in the space between two worlds, the interpreter that the creatures needed. The choice I made in isolation has ripples now, spreading outward in ways I can't control or even fully understand. But at least I am no longer alone. At least something needs me here. At least the emptiness inside me has been filled, even if what filled it was not what I expected or what I would have chosen if I had truly understood the cost. The deer in the clearing settle as darkness falls again, and I settle with them, and we all wait for whatever dawn will bring. My name is Dakota Vest, and I've been running toward isolation for 3 years now, though it took accepting this ranger position to finally admit what I was running from. The job posting appeared in November, during that desperate stretch when I'd burned through 2 positions in 18 months and my references were starting to look like a map of my failures. Appalachian National Forest, a remote sector near the Cumberland Plateau, 40 miles from the nearest town. The cabin came with it. Solitude, they said. Purpose, they implied. But what they meant was, nobody asks questions about a man who disappears into the woods. I drove the truck up the mountain on a Monday, November's edge of winter sharp in the air. The forest was already half dead, leaves rotting into the road, branches skeletal against a sky the color of old concrete. The cabin appeared through the gray like a forgotten thing. Dark wood and a sagging porch, smoke already rising from the chimney. My predecessor, Marcus, handing off this place the way you hand off a curse. He didn't stay long. 20 minutes of instructions, a folder of ranger reports, warnings about fall closures. But what I remember most was his eyes. They had the look of someone who'd seen something the world doesn't have words for, and he'd decided not to use the words anyway. The lake's 2 miles north, he said, pointing with a burned index finger. Mirror Lake, they call it. Don't go there after dark. Why? I asked. He was already walking back to his truck. You'll understand soon enough. That first month, the work was genuine. Trails to clear, equipment to maintain, reports to file. The sector was quiet, officially listed as dangerous due to unstable terrain and wildlife, but that was fine by me. It meant solitude. It meant nobody checking in, nobody remembering I existed. The cabin's isolation felt like mercy. December came with the first serious snow. I watched it settle on the pines from my window, a white silence that felt almost holy. The lake sat beyond the north ridge, visible in winter through the bare trees, smooth and dark as obsidian. I didn't go there. Not because of Marcus's warning. I didn't believe in warnings from men with trauma-haunted eyes, but because there was something about it that made my spine feel wrong. It was January when I first heard the sounds. They started on a night that had dropped to 15 degrees, the kind of cold that makes your breath solid. I was reading by the wood stove, the cabin warm and small around me, when I heard what sounded like someone calling, not words, just a sound, something between a wail and a howl, carrying across the frozen air from the direction of the lake. I told myself it was a fox. Foxes make sounds that can crack your certainty. They sound like suffering. I'd heard them before in other places, in other lives, but the sound came again, and this time it was followed by something else. Movement in the snow. Heavy movement. The weight of something large pressing through the drifts. I stood at the window, my breath fogging the glass, and watched the darkness beyond the tree line. The movement stopped. The sound came again, closer. Whatever it was testing the limits of the clearing around my cabin, testing whether anything human lived here. I sat by the stove until dawn, the fire burning down to coals, and I didn't sleep. The next morning I found the prints. They surrounded the cabin in a wide circle, starting about 20 feet out, never approaching closer than that. Something had walked the perimeter in the deep snow. Something heavy. The prints were distorted by melt and depth, but their pattern was methodical, circular, deliberate. Not a bear. Bears sleep. Not a deer or elk. The stride was wrong, the depth too consistent. Not any predator I could catalog in the reference books stacked in the cabin's back office. I called the district office in Cumberland. The ranger coordinator, a woman named Diane who'd hired me over the phone and never looked me in the eye, said it was probably a black bear out of hibernation due to warm weather. Happens sometimes, she said. Unusual, but not unheard of. It walked a complete circle around my cabin, I said. Curious, she said. Keep your distance. Any problems, let us know. She hung up before I could ask what kind of problem would require actually responding. That night, I made the mistake of looking. The lake was frozen solid by then, smooth and pale under the moonlight. I'd gone out just to move, to shake the creeping anxiety that had colonized my chest, and I'd walked to the ridge overlooking the water. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows, and in that light I could see something on the ice, a deer, just standing there, perhaps 50 yards from the shore, utterly still, no breath visible, no movement at all. Just standing in the exact center of that frozen mirror, facing away from everything. I watched it for maybe 3 minutes, waiting for it to move, waiting for it to do what animals do. Breathe, shift weight, register that something else was looking at it, but it did none of those things. It just stood there, a black shape against white, unmoving with the kind of unmoving that feels like death. Then it turned its head sideways, not toward me, just rotated so I could see the curve of its neck, the profile of its skull. It was a deer, but something about its proportions was wrong. The angles of its limbs didn't bend the way they should. The relationship between its body and its head seemed off by fractions that added up to something deeply disturbing. I ran straight back to the cabin, locked every door, and sat in the kitchen until the sun came up. By daylight, I told myself it had just been a trick of moonlight, a deer suffering from some wasting disease that had thrown off my perception. Chronic wasting disease sometimes made animals docile. The angles were probably normal. I'd just been primed to see something wrong by my own fear. But I knew I was lying. 3 days later, another body showed up at the lake. A hiker this time, a man named Raymond Chen, officially reported missing from a trail 8 miles east. They found him on the ice, just like the deer, standing upright, though he'd been dead for at least 48 hours according to the coroner's preliminary assessment. There was no sign of what had killed him, no trauma visible, no blood. His face was peaceful, almost serene, and his body faced the lake's center just as the deer had. The investigation was cursory. An accident, they ruled. Heart attack, probably, during a hike. He'd wandered onto the lake and collapsed. The cold had preserved him perfectly, which was why he was still upright when found. The ice had frozen him in place. Happens, Diane said over the phone, not bothering to hide her relief that it wasn't her responsibility. Winter's dangerous, people overestimate themselves. But I'd read the statement from the hikers who found him. Raymond Chen had been walking with his wife and brother. One moment he was there, the next moment he was just gone. They'd retraced their steps, called his name, searched for an hour before they decided he must have gone to the lake for water. When they finally checked the ice, he was already there, already dead, already standing in that pose of profound wrongness. The wife said he'd been acting strange all morning. Quiet, distracted. She said he'd kept walking toward the sound of the wind in the trees, and she and her brother had to keep bringing him back to the trail. She said it was like he was listening to something they couldn't hear. After they left, the wife and brother, escorted out by state police, traumatized and desperate to be gone, I began documenting things. Every night the sounds, every night movement. But they didn't come as close anymore. After Raymond Chen, whatever was out there seemed to have understood something. It had found what it was looking for, or it had learned that the cabin held something it didn't want. The sounds were varied. Sometimes the wailing, that hurt animal cry that made your muscles tense. Sometimes footsteps in the snow, purposeful and heavy. Sometimes something that sounded almost like breathing, except it came from the direction of the lake and it was far too loud to be any single animal. Sometimes, worst of all, I heard what sounded like words, fragmented, distorted, but clearly human phonemes arranged in nearly patterns that almost meant something. I documented the date, time, duration, and direction of each sound. I marked them on a topographic map. Looking at the map, I noticed something that made my hands shake. Every sound originated from within a specific range of bearings, all pointing back to Mirror Lake. More than that, the sounds had shifted over 3 weeks, forming an arc that was slowly, methodically positioning itself at various points around the cabin. It was mapping. Whatever this was, it was learning the position of my shelter, the distances, the sight lines, the way something does when it's planning. I should have left. Most sensible people would have driven away that day, called it illness or breakdown or anything but evidence of something that shouldn't exist. But I stayed. By February, I'd stopped pretending the sounds were wildlife. By February, I'd stopped calling them sounds. I started calling them visitations. The first time I saw it clearly was during a night when the moon was obscured by clouds and the darkness was complete. I was in the cabin's eastern room, doing something mundane and unnecessary, reorganizing the emergency supplies, I think, just to keep my hands moving, when I heard the breathing again, that enormous respiration that came from the lake direction, carrying on the frozen air. I went to the window, opened it. The cold hit me like a slap, vacuum deep and punishing. And I looked. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 40 yards out, at the precise limit where moonlight could have shown it if the moon existed that night. It was tall, very tall. That was what struck me first. Not its shape, not its nature, but simply the vertical distance from ground to what I assumed was its head. 7 feet minimum, maybe 8. The rest of it was suggestion. Outline. I couldn't see details so much as sense them. Something broad and heavy, something built for weight and force rather than anything graceful. And it was watching. I knew it was watching even though I couldn't see eyes because the attention was concrete as pressure. It didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there at that perimeter distance and let me understand that I could see it now, that it had decided I was ready. I closed the window and threw up in the kitchen sink. The next morning, I did something I'd been avoiding for 6 weeks. I called Marcus. He answered on the third ring, sounding like he'd been waiting for the phone to ring. "You're still there," he said. "No hello, no preamble. Something's at the lake," I said. "Yes, what is it?" There was a long pause. I could hear traffic in his background, the sounds of normal human civilization. He was already somewhere else, already trying to exist in the world without it. "Did you read the reports?" he asked. "The official records. Missing persons, nothing unusual." "Not those," he said. "The actual reports. In the back office, drawer beneath the filing cabinet. I found them that afternoon. Handwritten logs, pages of them dating back years. Observations by rangers going back to at least 2008. Footprints, sounds, sightings, all of it pointing to the lake, all of it describing something that couldn't be cataloged, tracked, or understood. And deaths. At least 7 confirmed, going back to 2015. All of them hikers found on the lake ice, all of them in that same pose of standing stillness, all of them originally attributed to accidents or natural causes. But there were notes, small observations from rangers who'd seen the bodies, strange facial expression, peaceful, like he was called away, like he wanted to be there. One ranger had written, "They walked to it at night. I watched one walk out onto the ice from the clearing, never made a sound, just walked like it was pulling him on strings." Another, "The people it takes develop a change. First they get quiet, then they listen, then they walk." I read until my vision blurred, and then I called Marcus again. "What happens if you leave?" I asked. "It comes with you," he said. "Or it doesn't, nobody knows. I left after 8 months. Sometimes I feel it. Feel the pull toward water, toward the darkness. I've moved 3 times because I could feel it tracking me. Other rangers said the same thing. One of them drove to a reservoir 1,000 miles away and it took him anyway, walking him right into the water in the middle of winter. "So we're infected," I said. "Something like that. It takes something from you, or it puts something in you. The ones it kills, they invite it, they walk to it. But the ones it lets live..." He trailed off. "What?" "We live with the invitation," he said, always waiting to accept. He hung up before I could ask him anything else. February transformed into March. The snow started to rot, becoming crust and then water, and the forest began to exhale the smell of things decomposing. Spring in the mountains is brutal, the season of exposure, of everything hidden by snow suddenly revealed in its half-rotten state. I went to the lake then. That was when I should have known I was too far gone. It was a clear morning, the kind where the cold has already broken, and you can almost believe winter is finished. I told myself I was going to document, to gather evidence, to be methodical and professional. But I knew, even as I was putting on my boots, that I was going to walk toward the water the way Raymond Chen had walked. That I was accepting something. The lake path was overgrown with rhododendron that hadn't been trimmed. The branches caught my shirt, left long scratches on my arms. I remember noticing that I didn't feel any of it. My skin registered the contact but not the pain, as though something had placed a barrier between sensation and reaction. Mirror Lake was still thawing around the edges, ice in the center, water pushing out in widening rings as the frozen mirror melted. And on that melting ice, about 200 yards from shore, was something that took a moment to resolve into understanding. A shape. Human-shaped but not quite. Standing motionless. The moment I saw it, I understood that it wasn't a thing that had come to the lake. It was a thing that lived here now. A previous visitor that had become part of the water's composition. A man, or the remnant of one, preserved in that standing pose. Neither alive nor properly dead. I walked toward the water. The ice held. Despite the thaw, despite the water running at the edges, it held. And I walked out onto it toward the figure, and I knew with absolute clarity that this was the moment where everything changed, that there was a threshold I was crossing that wouldn't reverse. I got close enough to see that the figure was Raymond Chen, the missing hiker from January. His skin was perfectly preserved, his clothes unchanged, but there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before he died. A satisfaction, a profound completion, and he was looking at me, not with eyes that moved, eyes that didn't move at all, but with a directed attention that meant I was being seen. "It's calling," a voice said. I turned. Behind me on the ice there were 3 more figures. 3 more shapes in human form, standing in the permanent posture of the lake's congregation. One was older, a woman in ranger clothes I didn't recognize. One was younger, a teenager in hiking gear. One was Marcus. No, not Marcus. Something that was wearing Marcus's shape, wearing his dimension, but with that same satisfied blankness that marked the others. "It's calling from below," the Raymond figure said, though his lips didn't move. "Can you feel it?" I could. Beneath the ice, beneath the water, something was calling, not with sound, with a pressure, a pull, an invitation that had nothing to do with words. It was calling all the walkers down, all the ones who had accepted, all the ones who had stopped being human. I understood then what the lake did. It wasn't a predator, it was a congregation. It was a place where the boundary between human and not human became porous, where you could dissolve into something else, something that would keep walking even after you'd stopped. And the worst part was knowing, absolutely knowing, that the dissolution felt like coming home. My hand moved toward the ice. I could feel the pull now, not just from below, but from the walking figure that had been Marcus. It wanted me to complete the circle. It wanted me to stand there and wait for the others. It wanted me to be here when the next call went out, the next sound across the frozen forest that would draw someone new. Then something cracked beneath my feet. The ice didn't break. Nothing fell through. But something shifted, and the spell fractured. I stumbled backward. The figures on the ice made no movement to follow, no attempt to maintain the pull. They just waited, that satisfied blankness never changing as I scrambled back toward the shore. I don't remember running. I remember being in the forest, running through branches that tore my face open, running with something like panic driving my legs. And I remember understanding as I ran that the pull hadn't released me. It had let me go. There was a difference. It had let me go because I wasn't ready, or because it wanted to let this play out longer, or because some part of it had decided that my resistance itself was part of what it wanted to consume. 3 weeks after the lake, the sounds stopped. Not gradually, completely and suddenly, like a switch had been flipped. The nights became silent. No wailing, no footsteps, no breathing from across the darkness. The cabin was quiet in a way it hadn't been since I arrived. I waited for the relief. It never came. Instead, there was something worse. A tension, an anticipation, the knowledge that the silence wasn't an ending. It was a preparation. I called district headquarters and requested a transfer. Diane said there wasn't anything available. I asked for a leave of absence. She said I needed to discuss that with management, and management wasn't available. I asked what would happen if I simply drove away. "Then you leave," she said. But I wouldn't recommend it. When I asked why, she didn't answer. That night, I saw the visitor in the clearing, not at the periphery, right in front of the cabin, in the light of the porch lamp. It had come closer, finally. I could see it clearly now, though my mind kept slipping away from actually perceiving the shape. There was something about it that resisted focus, as though the specific details would cause harm if I held them too long in my conscious attention. What I could understand was size, height, emaciation, and the sense of a profound hunger that went beyond physical appetite. Its face was turned toward the cabin window, toward me, and I felt the pull again, stronger than before, but this time it came with something else. Words, not heard. Felt, in my mind, in a voice that might have been my own but deeper, older, hungry with a starvation that had endured centuries. "You will walk," it said, not a question, not even a threat, a statement of intention. a promise made by something that knew how promises end. I locked myself in the cabin's root cellar, a small space beneath the kitchen that Marcus had marked on the layout as an emergency shelter. There was a radio there, old but functional. I used it to call the district office. When Diane answered, her tone suggested she'd been expecting this call. "It's offered," I said. "Yes," she said. "What do I do?" "You accept or refuse," she said. "You run or you stay. You go to the lake or you don't. None of it matters. The outcome's already decided. The only choice you have is whether you understand it before or after." "That's not a choice," I said. "No," she agreed. "It's the point." The line went dead. I sat in that cellar for 14 hours. The visit didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. It waited outside the cabin with the patience of something that existed beyond the normal constraints of hunger. And I sat in the dark, and I felt the pull still working, still calling, still promising that walking into the water would feel like the first peace I'd known in my entire life. By midnight, I was starting to believe it was true. That was when I understood the second trap. The first trap was the invitation. The second was knowing that accepting was surrender, but refusing was just extended suffering. You could stay locked in a root cellar while your entire being wanted to move toward the water. You could white-knuckle your way through another day, and another, slowly being eroded by your own resistance. The lake didn't need you to walk out on the ice. It was patient. It would wait until you were hollow enough that walking was easier than existing. Around 2 in the morning, I came up from the cellar. The thing was still in the clearing. Closer now, right at the edge of the lamplight, and I could see more of it. The wrongness was worse at close distance. The angles of its limbs, the way it held its weight, the suggestion of a mouth that was larger than any mouth should be. And when it turned its attention to me, I felt something inside me crack open. "You're one of those that almost dies before it leaves," the voice said through my own consciousness. "Those make better walkers. They understand the difference between hunger and being hungry." I picked up a rifle from the rack by the kitchen door. I'd never used it. I knew the basics from the ranger certification, but I'd never needed to. Now I checked the chamber, aimed through the window, and fired. The thing didn't flinch. The bullet went through it, through empty air that had worn the shape of something solid for just long enough to be convincing. "It's not here," the voice said. "It will never be here. It's at the lake. It will always be at the lake. What's in the clearing is only your own understanding of what it is. Shoot that all you want." I lowered the rifle. I was shaking now, real shaking, the kind that uses all your will and still can't be stopped. "Why?" I asked. "Why not just kill me? Why this?" There was something in the darkness that might have been amusement. "Because death is only the end of walking," it said. "And I want walkers, not endings. You will walk eventually. The only question is whether you'll still be yourself when you do." The thing left before dawn. I didn't see it go, but I felt the pressure release. Felt the pull recede just slightly, enough that breathing became easier. I was sitting on the porch when the sun came up, the rifle across my lap, and I watched the clearing fill with normal light. It was March 14th. I'd been at the cabin for 4 months. I made coffee and sat on the porch steps, and I tried to think about what I was going to do. The options were still the same ones they'd always been. Stay and resist, stay and eventually walk, or leave and be haunted. None of them were solutions, they were just different formats of the same ending. A truck came up the mountain road around 8 a.m. It was strange enough. Nobody came up the ranger road that early, especially not in March when the upper roads were still rough, that I actually paid attention. The truck pulled up to the cabin, and Diane got out. The real Diane, not a vision or a shape wearing her appearance. Just a woman in ranger colors, looking tired and resigned. "Pack a bag," she said. "You're being reassigned." "Where?" "Away," she said. "Doesn't matter. The point is to get you distance from the water." "It comes with you," I said. "Marcus told me. It follows." "Some people," Diane said. "It follows. Some people, it lets go. We don't know why. But we've learned that moving them helps, creates enough disruption that sometimes the connection breaks. Not always, but sometimes." I stared at her. "How many rangers know about this?" "All of them," she said. "All of them, eventually. Every ranger they assign to any park with deep water knows, because sooner or later they figure it out, and then the service has to decide whether to transfer them or let them walk. Most people walk. A few don't. A few survive long enough that the connection breaks." "What's the percentage?" I asked. "About 1 in 4, she said. "Most people have enough sense to know when they're beaten." I packed a bag. Clothes, personal items, the documentation I'd kept. Diane watched from the kitchen, drinking my coffee, looking at the maps I'd marked with the sound locations. She picked up one of the marked maps and examined it. "This is good work," she said. "Methodical. You really tried to understand it." "What is it?" I asked. "Actually, I know what it does. I don't know what it is." "Neither do we," Diane said. "The lakes have been watched for a long time. There's documented activity going back 2 centuries in the ranger records. Maybe longer, maybe forever. Some of the older records talk about old names, indigenous peoples talking about the water dwellers, things that lived in deep places and called to travelers. Maybe it's always been there. Maybe it's something that emerged from the deep. Maybe it's just hunger that learned to wear a shape." She folded the map carefully. "What I know is this: it doesn't leave, it doesn't die, and it always gets fed. The only variable is who does the walking. We move rangers to break the connection, and most of them die anyway, get pulled toward water weeks or months away. But a few, somehow, the thread breaks. They get distance enough or time enough, or they're broken in a way that doesn't match what it's looking for. Those people get to live." "And the ones it kills?" I asked. "Raymond Chen, the others, those were people who couldn't resist," Diane said. "The pull was too strong, or the offer was too good, and they walked. Once you walk, there's no coming back. You just stand there in the congregation, forever, and you wait for the next one." I closed the bag. Diane drove me down the mountain without talking. When we reached the highway, she handed me a folder. "New assignment," she said. "Rocky Mountain Sector, Glacier National Park, Montana. Different water, but you'll be familiar with it. Cabin by a lake there too. You'll probably feel the pull there as well." "Why would you send me to another lake?" I asked. "Because," she said, "we want to see if distance helps. We want to see if you're one of the ones that the connection releases. And because the alternative is firing you, and if we fire you, the Ranger Service has to admit that something's happening in our parks that we can't explain, that we've been covering up for decades. That's not acceptable to people making decisions about budgets and public relations." She turned the truck around and drove back up the mountain. I sat there on the highway, bag in the truck bed, watching her go. And I understood the final layer of it. The lake didn't just take walkers, it took institutions, it took the people in charge and made them complicit. It took the thing they pretended not to see and made the pretense part of the system. It was already far more successful than any monster could ever be. I drove north that night. The pull followed, a pressure in my chest, a hunger in the back of my throat that wanted me to stop at every body of water and check if the pull was stronger, would be stronger, would always be stronger. I got to Glacier in 3 days. The cabin was identical to the one I'd left. Different lake, same geometry, different pull, same invitation. I spent the first week testing distances, drove away. The pull didn't weaken, came back, tried to understand what Diane had meant by breaking the connection. On the 8th day, I walked to the lake. I don't remember the decision. I remember standing at the shore, and I remember knowing that I'd accept, that I was tired of refusing, that the waiting was worse than the walking. I remember feeling the ice solid beneath my feet despite the spring warmth. I remember walking out onto the water. I remember the figure that had been waiting. It was tall, it was hungry, it was everything I'd been running from for 4 months and everything I'd been running from for years before that. And then I felt something shift, like a door closing, like the connection severing, not gently but completely. The figure on the ice looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, and then it turned away. I don't remember walking back, but I did. My boots were wet, my clothes were torn, my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks, and the pull was gone. I could feel where it had been, a phantom limb, a pressure that wasn't quite touching anything, but it was gone. Diane had been right. I was one of the ones that the connection released. I filed a transfer request the next day, told them I couldn't handle the elevation, that I was having panic attacks, that I needed to go back to lower altitude. They assigned me to a sector in Texas, low country, nothing but prairie and scrub brush, no lakes, no water deep enough to hold anything. I drove there in April. I've been there for 7 months now. The pressure hasn't come back, but sometimes, at night, I still feel it. The attention, the pull, not stronger, just waiting, testing, like something that knows I'm still out there, and someday, when I let my guard down, when I have to cross a river or swim at a beach or find myself beside deep water in the dark, it will remember me. Marcus called me last month, said he felt it coming back, said the distance had held for 5 years, but something had shifted. He'd started hearing sounds again, water sounds, calling sounds. I didn't have anything to tell him except to keep moving. We're all moving now. All the ones who survived. All the ones the lake released. We move from water to water, running but not really running, because the only thing that matters is the waiting. The knowledge that it's patient, that it has forever, that the only ending is when you finally stop being afraid enough to walk. Some nights I drive toward deep water just to test myself, just to see if the pressure is coming back, if my resistance is starting to fail. So far I've always turned around, but I don't know how much longer I can keep turning. I don't know if that's the point. I don't know if refusing is just delayed walking, or if there's actually a way to break free. All I know is that I'm still here, still alive, still running, still waiting for the night when I hear it calling again and I don't fight it. And the worst part is knowing that when that night comes, it will feel like finally going home. My name is Dakota Rivers, and I've been a park ranger for 15 years. That's the kind of introduction people expect when something has gone wrong, when you need to establish credibility before admitting you've witnessed something impossible. So let me explain how I ended up at a remote ranger station in the Appalachian Mountains, 3 hours from the nearest town, where cell service dies around mile marker 4 and the radio barely works on days when the atmospheric conditions align just right. The job offer came in October. I was working at Glacier National Park in Montana, a posting I'd held for 8 years. The pay was decent, the work was meaningful, and the landscape was everything I'd trained for, but there was a problem with meaning and routine. They eventually suffocate each other. By my 14th year in uniform, I was going through the motions. Seasonal trail maintenance, the same search and rescue operations, bears doing bearish things in bearish places, nothing sinister, nothing that kept me awake at night except for the quiet knowledge that I'd become someone who went through checklists instead of living. The email came from an administrative office in West Virginia. They were understaffed at Blackwater Ridge Ranger Station, a position that had seen 3 separate rangers quit within 18 months. The last one, according to the brief note, had requested an emergency transfer without explanation. When I called the hiring officer, she was surprisingly evasive about the details. "It's remote," she said. "Isolated. The previous ranger may not have been suited to solo work." I should have asked more questions. A reasonable person would have. But I was 39 years old and tired of being reasonable. I was tired of the life I'd built perfectly and the emptiness it contained. So when she mentioned the cabin was on the edge of Mirror Lake, with decent equipment and a newer radio system, I heard possibility instead of warning. I moved to West Virginia in late November. The cabin sits on a peninsula that juts into the northern stretch of Mirror Lake. It's a solid structure, built in the 1970s and upgraded periodically since then. 1 main room with a kitchenette, bedroom, bathroom with running water from a well, and a covered porch that overlooks the water. They'd installed a satellite internet system, so I had basic connectivity when I needed it. There's a dock where you can keep a small boat, though I didn't have one yet, and a trail system that extends in 3 directions from my property line. The first week was administrative. I processed files, understood the radio frequencies, reviewed the incident logs from the past 5 years. The official report on my predecessor, Dale Hutchins, was sparse. He'd worked the position for 14 months. There were no recorded complaints or incidents, no accident or injury. He simply requested a transfer and was approved. The reason field just said personal reasons. What struck me most was the lack of detail in the logs about the surrounding area. Most ranger stations maintain meticulous records of unusual wildlife activity, weather patterns, rescue operations, even odd occurrences that don't classify as official incidents. The Blackwater Ridge logs contained almost nothing like that. It was as if the previous rangers had filed reports and filed away their thoughts. I started my patrols in early December. The trails around the station were well maintained, which suggested recent work. There were 3 primary routes: the Ridgeline Trail, which ascended to higher elevations and connected to county roads; the Lakeside Loop, which circled the entire northern section of Mirror Lake; and the North Fork Trail, which descended into the valley and required both climbing and careful footing through rocky terrain. The park itself is beautiful in a way that feels almost conscious. The Appalachian landscape has been weathered down by time into rounded mountains with deep hollows and ridges that catch the light at specific angles. In December, the deciduous trees had dropped their leaves, leaving the oak and hickory standing skeletal against a gray sky. The hemlocks and pines held their color, providing contrast. But there was something about the lack of undergrowth that made the forest feel exposed, like something had recently passed through and cleared a path. On my 3rd day, I encountered my first visitor. A man named Boyd Kessler came up the main trail in a Toyota that had seen better decades. He was in his 60s, lean, with the kind of weathered face that suggested a life lived outdoors. He introduced himself as a local who occasionally hunted in the valley, and he wanted to make sure I knew the regulations. Seemed reasonable until he started asking questions. "You planning to stay long?" he asked, standing between me and my porch. "Indefinitely," I said. "It's my assignment." "That right. Well," he looked toward the lake, then back at me. "Previous fella didn't last. One before that too. They got spooked." "Spooked by what?" I asked. Boyd took a long time answering. "Area's got a reputation," he finally said. "Folks don't come out here much after dark. Deer act strange sometimes, real strange. And there's sounds that don't belong to anything official like." I thanked him for the warning, made it clear I was trained for wildlife management, and he eventually left. But after he drove away, I stood on the porch and looked at the lake, really looked at it, trying to see whatever it was that had frightened two grown men out of a perfectly good job. That night I sat in the cabin and read through the incident logs again, this time looking for things that weren't there. Absences can be as meaningful as presence. What I found was a pattern of willful ignorance, logs that should have contained entries but didn't, a section labeled Winter 2022 Activity that contained only the date field and nothing else, a reference to a visual contact event in March 2023 that was reported but never elaborated upon. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. It came from across the lake, where the forest rose up in a black wall against a starless sky. It was a call, almost like a deer, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The pitch was too consistent, too deliberate. It rose and fell like something learning to use a voice for the first time. I told myself it was a deer. Deer make strange sounds sometimes, especially during rut season or when they're in distress. I told myself this firmly enough that I almost believed it. I should have listened to Boyd. I should have asked him what he meant. I should have driven down to the nearest town and made phone calls and demanded actual information instead of administrative vagueness. But it was late and I was exhausted, and I had chosen this isolation deliberately, so I closed the curtains and tried to sleep while that sound continued across the lake, calling into the darkness like something was asking for an answer that would never come. December in Appalachia is wet. Rain falls frequently, but it rarely freezes solid because the temperatures fluctuate. One day it's 35 degrees and drizzling, the next it's 40 and misty, then back down to 20. This creates conditions where the trails become treacherous. Water flows under a thin crust of ice. Moss grows thick on the north sides of trees, and the stone underfoot is perpetually slick. On December 17th, I received a call from the county sheriff's office. Two hikers were overdue from a trip on the North Fork Trail. They'd left from a trailhead on the county side, planned to traverse the ridge, and were supposed to be out by 5 p.m. It was now nearly 8. Their families had called when they didn't return to their car. The names were Derek and Marcus Venn, brothers from Beckley, experienced hikers who knew the area. They'd done this route 3 times before. The last official report of them was a photograph posted to social media at 2:20 p.m., showing them at Mirror Lake's northern point, smiling, with the comment, "Beautiful afternoon." I organized a search immediately. At this hour, with the weather shifting toward cold and the light completely gone, every minute mattered. I radioed the station to let them know I was mobilizing search protocols and headed out with a flashlight and emergency supplies. The North Fork Trail descends about 900 feet over 3 miles, following a creek that feeds into Mirror Lake. In good conditions, it takes about an hour to traverse. In wet conditions, especially at night, it becomes a different kind of challenge. Your foot catches on roots you can't see. Stones shift, the sound of the creek becomes hypnotic, and it's easy to lose your orientation. I moved down the trail carefully, calling their names periodically. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness ineffectually, illuminating only a few feet ahead before the forest swallowed the light again. Around me, the woods were alive with sound. Small animals moving through the undergrowth, branches settling and creaking, the ever-present movement of water. About a mile down, I found Derek's jacket. It was hanging on a low branch, torn at the left shoulder, one arm completely shredded. The fabric showed marks that were too precise to be accidental. The tiers were parallel, spaced with almost geometric regularity, as if something with multiple points had dragged the jacket repeatedly across the branch. I photographed it with my Ranger radio camera and placed it in an evidence bag. I continued calling their names. The forest seemed to hold my voice, refusing to let it carry far. Around me, the trees pressed close, and I became aware of something I hadn't noticed before: the lack of wildlife sound. It wasn't that the woods were quiet. They were full of sound, but there were no birds, no larger animals, nothing except the sound of running water and my own breathing. About 2 miles down, I heard something that stopped me completely. It was Marcus's voice, coming from somewhere to my left, off the trail. He was calling for help, his voice strained and exhausted. I turned immediately and moved toward the sound, pushing through thick undergrowth, my flashlight catching on branches and brush. But as I moved closer, the voice changed. It became more insistent, more desperate, but also less coherent. The words became sounds, the sounds became something like words but not quite. It was Marcus's voice, or a voice shaped exactly like Marcus's voice. But something was wrong with the inflection, the cadence. A human voice would lose energy as the person grew exhausted, but this voice maintained perfect intensity, only varying in tone. I stopped moving and killed my flashlight. In the sudden darkness, the voice continued. I heard my own breathing, the rain on the leaves around me, and that voice that might have been Marcus's, or might have been something using Marcus's voice as a template. I backed away slowly. My training said to stay calm and search methodically, but something older than training said to move away from that voice. I returned to the trail and continued downward, abandoning the sound. Another quarter-mile down, I found Marcus himself. He was sitting against a hemlock tree beside the creek, his legs extended, his upper body leaning back against the bark. He wasn't moving. When I approached him, I saw why. His eyes were open and focused on something in the middle distance that I couldn't see. His mouth was slightly open. His right arm was bent at an angle that meant the bones underneath were broken. But what stopped me from checking for a pulse was the fact that his left arm was missing entirely from the elbow down. The wound wasn't fresh. There was no blood running, no signs of recent trauma. It looked like something that had healed into a scar that hadn't had time to become less horrifying. I found Derek 200 yards further downstream. He was floating in a deep section of the creek, his body snagged on a fallen tree. It took me 40 minutes to extract him and move him to the bank. Like Marcus, he was cold, which meant he'd been there for hours. His death appeared to have come from drowning, though there were marks around his wrists that suggested he'd been held under the water. I radioed the sheriff's office and waited for support. It took 90 minutes for a rescue team to reach my position. By then I'd examined the bodies more closely than I wanted to, took photographs, and noticed something that made my hands shake while I documented it. Both bodies had defensive wounds on their hands. Both had evidence of having tried to climb the creek bank and failing. Both bore marks that didn't match any wildlife found in this region, and Marcus's voice, the one that had called to me in the darkness, had stopped completely once I'd found his body. The official report blamed the creek conditions and lack of safety protocols. Derek had slipped into the water in the darkness. Marcus had tried to rescue him and been pulled in as well. The injuries were attributed to the rocky bottom, the thrashing of drowning men, the natural trauma of the creek. The injuries to Derek's wrists could be explained by Marcus trying to pull him from the water. It was an explanation that required no supernatural elements, no unexplainable phenomena. It was therefore accepted completely by the county coroner. But I watched the video footage of the rescue effort that night, sitting in my cabin with the doors locked and every light on. I watched them pull Marcus's body from the creek and noted the exact wounds. Then I listened to the audio recording I'd made during my search, the one where that voice was calling to me in the darkness, using Marcus's own voice to pull me in the wrong direction. I didn't sleep that night. After the hikers' deaths, I made a decision that a reasonable person might question. Instead of requesting a transfer, instead of finding an excuse to leave Blackwater Ridge, I decided to stay and understand what was happening. I knew I was in danger. There was no longer any doubt about that. But I had professional obligations, and there were rules about this job that went beyond the official manual. If something was killing people on this land, if something had driven 3 rangers away, then leaving meant it would continue unopposed. Someone else would take this job. Someone else might die. I began my own investigation. I pulled the complete history of the ranger station, not just the official logs but the maintenance records, the equipment requisitions, anything with a date and a signature. I found that Dale Hutchins, my immediate predecessor, had filed 3 separate work orders requesting additional security equipment. Motion-sensitive lights, trail cameras, an upgraded radio system. All 3 requests had been denied or delayed due to budget constraints. He'd also made 3 separate visits to the county sheriff's office to file reports. Those reports had gone missing from the official records, but I found a reference to them in a note written by the county's administrative officer. Deputy Vance responded to rangers' concerns regarding animal activity, no evidence of unusual wildlife behavior. Recommended rangers seek additional rest. I understood then. This place didn't want help. The county, the state, the bureaucratic structure above me, they all had an investment in this place being normal. A ranger station in a normal area with normal animals doing normal things. Any suggestion otherwise became a problem with the ranger, not the place, so I stopped reporting through official channels. Instead, I began keeping my own records. I mapped every location where I found evidence of unusual activity. The claw marks on the trees near the North Trail. The deer carcass, only partially eaten, positioned deliberately on the ridgeline trail where I would find it. The tracks that appeared near my cabin, large and bipedal, but with a stride that was subtly wrong, the weight distributed in a way that no creature I could identify would move. And I recorded the sounds. Every night, the lake produced sound. It came from different locations, different distances, but it was consistent. The calls that sounded like deer but weren't. The sound of something moving through the forest with deliberate slowness. Once, a voice that was almost human, almost understandable, calling words that dissolved into static on my recording equipment. 2 weeks after finding the Venn brothers, I encountered my first direct contact. I was running the lakeside loop at dawn, moving quickly while the light was dim but improving. I had learned that the time just before sunrise was when the forest felt least hostile. The nocturnal activity had ceased, but the diurnal activity hadn't begun. There was a window of perhaps 30 minutes when I could move without the constant sense of being observed. I was about halfway through the loop when I saw the deer. It was standing in the middle of the trail, motionless, about 40 yards ahead. This alone wasn't unusual. Deer frequently appear on trails. What was unusual was its posture. Its back legs were locked in a way that looked painful. Its spine curved upward, its head tilted at an angle that a normal cervical spine couldn't achieve. It was watching me with an intensity that predators possess, not prey animals. I stopped moving. The deer didn't. We regarded each other across the 40-yard distance. I'd seen photographs of animals with chronic wasting disease, a condition that affects the nervous system. This looked similar in some ways, but different in the ways that mattered. The deer's eyes were clear and intelligent. Its head tilt wasn't neurological, it was deliberate. Then slowly it began to move forward. Not in the bouncing gait of a deer, but in a stalking walk, one hoof placed carefully in front of another, its neck keeping my body in perfect focus. I drew my ranger pistol. It wasn't intended for wildlife, but I carried it for human emergencies and because regulations required it. I aimed at the space between the deer and myself. When it was perhaps 15 yards away, it did something that made my hand shake. It tried to make a sound, not a normal deer sound, but something that approximated human speech. It was attempting to produce a word, the same word, over and over, a sound like come, mixed with something else. Something that made my hindbrain scream that this was not a deer, not something the natural world contained. I fired the weapon. The deer leapt sideways and was gone, bounding away into the forest at an angle that real anatomy shouldn't have permitted. I reloaded and waited, but it didn't return. That night, I radioed Dale Hutchins at his new posting in North Carolina. It took 3 separate calls through the Ranger network before I reached him. When he finally answered, his voice was cautious, like he was speaking around danger. He'd been warned not to discuss anything about Blackwater Ridge. His transfer agreement contained a non-disclosure clause. These things were implicit, but there nonetheless. I understand, I told him. I'm not asking for details, I'm just asking if I should stay. There was a long silence. I could hear wind in the background, the sound of a small town at night. I don't recommend it, he said finally. The place, the area, it's older than the park. What's there? It's been there longer than our records go. I don't think it's the kind of thing you can solve. What did it try to do to you? I asked. Isolation, he said. It isolates you, gets you alone, and then it tries things. I'd seen hikers go missing, I'd heard things, but the worst part was when I realized I couldn't leave. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The idea of driving down that road became physically impossible. I'd put the key in the ignition and my body would refuse. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat in the darkness of my cabin and understood that something in the forest around me had developed mechanisms for keeping people in place. It had learned, across centuries perhaps, what worked and what didn't. And it had learned, very well, how to make a human believe that leaving was impossible even when leaving was the only rational choice. I determined that whatever was moving through the forest around Blackwater Ridge operated on specific patterns. It was most active at night, between the hours of 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. It seemed to focus on people rather than animals, though it used animals as tools, as lures. It was intelligent, learned, and capable of mimicry. And it was patient in a way that suggested hunger rather than immediate aggression. It was also watching me. I noticed this most acutely during the daylight hours. The sense of being observed didn't diminish. It had become constant. but I could only articulate it when the sun was down and my nerves were wound tight. I'd find evidence of observation. A window I'd closed the night before standing slightly open. My food supplies arranged differently. My bed unmade in a way I didn't remember doing. On December 28th, something changed. The activity intensified. It started with the radio. I was in the cabin around 9 p.m. when the equipment activated on its own, despite being on standby. The frequency shifted to something that shouldn't exist, static that was almost melody, and then, with perfect clarity, a voice. It was my voice. It said my name, Dakota, with my exact inflection. It said things I'd said to myself in the privacy of my cabin. Private thoughts, shameful admissions about why I'd taken this job, what I'd been running from, how alone I felt. It knew the specific details of my isolation, and it was using my own voice to confirm every reason I should have been afraid from the beginning. I shut down the radio system entirely and sat in the darkness of the cabin trying to slow my breathing. Then something hit the front window with enough force to crack the glass. It wasn't an animal attack, it was deliberate, something testing the barrier. I turned on every light in the cabin and moved to the window, staying out of direct line with the glass. There was nothing visible outside. Just the darkness of the porch, the outline of the lake beyond, the black shapes of trees against a starless sky. But I could hear sound around the cabin, circling it. Not footsteps, something that moved too silently for that. It was testing the perimeter. I grabbed my emergency pack, which I'd prepared weeks ago in anticipation of exactly this situation. Inside were supplies for the forest, water filtration, emergency rations, flares, backup batteries, my personal recording equipment. I locked the cabin and moved to the edge of the porch, waiting. When it came from behind. Something struck me across the shoulders, driving me forward into the railing. The impact was substantial, heavy, and whatever had hit me made a sound like satisfaction, like something confirming a theory. I rolled forward off the porch onto the ground below, scrambled to my feet, and ran toward the lake. The trail to the dock was something I'd memorized during daylight, and my feet found it in the darkness. Behind me I could hear it following, but not running. It was pacing itself, confident in the outcome. I reached the dock and ran its length, then plunged into the lake. The water was cold enough that it shocked my system, but I was moving before panic could set in. I swam out from the dock, toward the center of the lake, moving as silently as possible. Behind me I heard the thing reach the dock. It didn't follow into the water. Instead, it simply waited, and I heard that sound again, the sound of something breathing, satisfied, patient. I swam until the dock was invisible behind me, then turned toward the eastern shore and made for solid ground. The lake was black, and I had no way to see what might be moving beneath the surface, so I didn't think about it. I simply swam with mechanical efficiency, trying to reach the opposite shore before my body decided it was too cold to continue. When my feet found bottom, I was shaking with something more profound than hypothermia. I crawled onto the eastern bank and lay there gasping, listening to the sounds of the night. The thing had not followed into the water, which suggested that something about the lake itself was a boundary it didn't cross, or wouldn't, or couldn't. I dragged myself further from the shore and opened my pack with numb fingers. I changed out of my wet clothes and into the emergency gear I'd prepared. Then I activated my personal recording device and spoke into it, documenting everything I'd learned, everything I'd experienced, everything the official channels would never hear. This was insurance. This was testimony. This was the only record that would survive if I didn't. From the western shore, across the lake, I heard my voice calling me by name. I spent the night on the eastern shore of Mirror Lake, sitting with my back against a hemlock tree, listening to the sounds of something searching for me across the water. It called to me in voices it had learned. It promised me warmth and safety and rest. It told me about my childhood in words only my mother would have used. It was patient, creative, and utterly relentless in its attempt to break my will. By dawn, I understood something critical. It couldn't cross the lake, or it wouldn't, which amounted to the same thing. The water itself seemed to be a barrier, possibly a limit imposed by whatever territorial understanding governed this creature's existence. It controlled the land, the forest, the trails, and the cabins, but the lake remained neutral ground. I stayed on the water. I found an old rowboat half-submerged on the eastern shore, likely abandoned by previous rangers. The hull was intact despite apparent years of disuse. I bailed out the accumulated water, salvaged the oars, and pushed off into the lake, positioning myself roughly at the center, equidistant from both shores. I had no supplies beyond what was in my pack. No food beyond the emergency rations that would sustain me for perhaps 3 days if I rationed carefully. No way to contact help while the radio system was compromised. No plan beyond survival through the next 72 hours, which was how long I estimated it would take for someone to become concerned about my lack of response. The fact was that I had become the missing person in this equation. The ranger who'd stopped reporting in. The one the county would eventually search for, only to find my cabin empty, evidence of struggle, and no body. The one who would join the legend of Blackwater Ridge, become a story that locals told about the place, the ranger who'd been taken by something that lived in the mountains. Unless I could survive long enough for rescue. I spent the first day floating in the boat, watching both shores, documenting the activity around the cabin. It had breached the building sometime during the night, and from the violence of the damage, it was searching for me with increasing frustration. It tore through the walls. It overturned furniture. It made sounds like screaming, like rage, like hunger denied. Around noon, someone appeared on the western shore. It was Boyd Kessler, the man who'd warned me on my first week. He was standing at the edge of the lake, looking toward my boat, and he was waving. He was calling my name, telling me to come back, that everything was fine, that I'd misunderstood the situation. The problem was that Boyd had died. I knew this with absolute certainty because I'd filed the missing persons report for him myself. 2 weeks ago, when local authorities finally admitted that he'd been missing for 3 months. His truck had been found abandoned near the county line, and no body had ever been recovered. I stayed in the boat and watched this version of Boyd until it got tired of trying and returned to the forest. The second night was worse because of the cold. Without movement to generate heat, my body began to fail. I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket from my pack and sat in the bottom of the boat, shaking, trying to think through the mathematical probability of my survival. My best estimate was 35%. That's what I kept repeating, the only number that felt honest. 35% that the weather would remain clear enough for helicopter rescue. 35% that my body would stay functional long enough for that rescue to matter. 35% that whatever was in the forest couldn't solve the problem of the water. On the morning of the third day, I heard the helicopter. It came from the south, its rotors cutting through the air with mechanical authority. I could see it approaching through the gray light, and I stood in the boat, waving the emergency reflector, making myself visible. It circled the cabin once, then pivoted toward me. As it descended, I could see the rangers inside it, could see them assessing the situation, could see them beginning the coordination necessary to extract a person from a small boat in the middle of a large lake. But the helicopter didn't land. Instead, it held position about 50 feet above me, and I watched the door slide open. The ranger inside was gesturing, not waving, but something more urgent, pointing toward the shore. I turned to look. The thing had stopped trying to hide. It was standing at the water's edge, fully visible, no longer making any effort at camouflage or mimicry. It was tall and lean and shaped like something that had once been human but had been redesigned by something that didn't understand human anatomy. Its limbs were too long, its posture was too flexible, its head rotated slowly as it watched the helicopter, studying it with the kind of interest that suggested it was learning, cataloging, preparing for future encounters. The helicopter began to ascend immediately. The door closed. I realized then that the pilot had seen something that made extraction impossible, that whatever protection the water offered would only last until the creature solved the problem of the lake itself. I watched the helicopter rise higher, watched it circle once more, a final documentation of the scene, and watched it turn south toward town. I was not being rescued, I was being marked. The helicopter would report what it had seen. The county would coordinate a response, and in the 7 hours it would take them to organize a proper team with proper equipment. The thing at the water's edge would do something I hadn't anticipated. It walked into the lake. It didn't swim. It simply walked down the slope of the shoreline, maintaining perfect balance even as the water reached its knees, then its torso, then its head. It walked across the bottom of the lake, a depth of 40 feet in the center, as casually as it had walked through the forest. I started rowing. I pulled the oars with every remaining ounce of strength in my body. I aimed toward the north, toward the dock, toward the cabin, choosing a destination even though I knew all destinations had become equally catastrophic. The creature rose from the water 50 yards behind me. Water cascaded off its form, and it didn't accelerate, didn't rush, simply began following me with the same patient certainty it had demonstrated on land. I reached the dock and scrambled out of the boat, moving on legs that weren't responding properly to the signals my brain was sending. I ran toward the cabin, knowing it was a trap, knowing that running into a building with one creature was infinitely worse than staying on the open ground, but running anyway because there were no good options, only options that varied in their particularity. I made it to the cabin door. It was still open from the creature's initial breach. I ran inside and locked it, a meaningless gesture but something, and moved to the back room where I'd kept my supplies. The creature hit the door with impact that suggested the building would not contain it for long. I moved to the back window, released the emergency latch, and pushed it open. Beyond was a straight drop to the rocky ground 15 feet below, but I didn't hesitate. I climbed through and jumped. I landed hard enough that I heard something break in my left foot, felt it immediately, understood that mobility had just become significantly compromised. Behind me, the creature was extricating itself from the window. I ran anyway, ran with a limping gait that was more falling than running, ran away from the cabin and the lake and toward the forest in a direction that made no geographic sense. I ran toward the dark between the trees where there was no visibility, no hope, no rational explanation for continued survival. The creature caught me approximately 40 yards from the cabin. It struck from the side, and my vision filled with images that I cannot adequately describe because no person should be adequately equipped to describe such things. I felt impact, then I felt nothing, then I felt something again, a sensation of being held, of being carried, of being brought somewhere specific, and then I felt the sound of a voice, not in my ears but in my mind, not words but meaning. It was telling me that my role was changing, that I was no longer a threat or a pest or an inconvenient witness, that I had become, through the process of being caught and consumed, something that understood the forest, that I would become a tool, a voice, a message, that I would become part of what called through the darkness to the next person foolish enough to accept employment at Blackwater Ridge. But before that transformation could complete, I heard the roar of engines on the access road. The county rescue team had come faster than expected. 8 vehicles with emergency lights and personnel trained for extraction and confrontation. The creature dropped me, pulled away, retreated toward the forest with a speed that suggested the arrival of multiple humans with tools was worth abandoning a meal for. I was found in the pine straw, still conscious, still aware, still capable of being rescued. The official report said I'd fallen while hiking, that the injuries were consistent with trauma from a fall, that my mental state had been compromised by isolation and hypothermia. The county coroner confirmed that there were no bite marks, no evidence of predation, nothing that couldn't be explained by bad luck and worse terrain. I was medically discharged from the ranger service. I was offered counseling. I was given a small pension and suggestions about how to rebuild my life away from wilderness work. But I remember the feeling when the creature held me. I remember the meaning it communicated. I remember understanding that my transformation was interrupted, not prevented. That something of the forest still moved through my consciousness, still whispered to me in the hours before dawn. I started recording these memories because I had to. Because someone needs to know what's really happening at Blackwater Ridge. Because the next ranger to take that job will be walking into something that has learned from me, something that has studied human behavior through my eyes and fears, something that will be infinitely better prepared. They found my replacement 3 weeks ago. His name is Victor Holt. He's confident, experienced, and completely unaware of what's waiting for him on the peninsular with the lake. They always are. I've tried to warn him. The warnings don't get through. Last week, I received a letter postmarked from West Virginia. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph of Mirror Lake at sunset, the cabin visible in the background, perfectly peaceful. On the back, in handwriting that was almost mine, someone had written, "Thank you for showing us how to call across the miles. The next one won't run." I keep the photograph on my desk where I can see it. Someday, when the dreams are too frequent and the isolation becomes too complete, I suspect I'll drive back to West Virginia. I suspect I'll walk into the forest. And I suspect I'll finally understand what I became when those hands that weren't hands held me beneath the hemlocks. Some jobs don't end when you quit them. Some jobs follow you because you've already agreed to them in ways you can never fully revoke. I check my radio sometimes. I listen to the static. And I wait for the voice of my own voice calling my name again because I know that eventually, inevitably it will. I came to Scotech Lake because I needed to disappear, not in the dramatic sense that most people mean when they talk about vanishing into wilderness. I needed to stop existing in the way I had been existing, checking boxes in a cubicle, watching spreadsheets grow like cancers across monitors, pretending that quarterly reports meant something about the state of the world. I was 34 years old and had spent the last 12 years making decisions that mattered to no one, least of all myself. So when the posting came through for a seasonal ranger position at the Appalachian National Forest Protection District, I applied without much consideration of what it actually entailed. The interview was brief. Regional Director Kessler, a man with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to measure something beyond what was visible, sat across from me in an office that smelled like coffee and old paper. "Why do you want this?" he asked, sliding the position description across the table. It was sparse on details: wilderness monitoring, equipment maintenance, incident response, 2 seasons of 8-month stretches, minimum. "I need quiet," I said. He nodded as if I'd answered a much more complicated question. Scotech Station is about as quiet as it gets. 73 square miles of remote territory. The cabin sits on the north shore of the lake. Nearest town is Bridgeton, 42 miles south. Supply run comes once a month. Radio contact only for emergencies and weekly check-ins. He paused, studying me. Last ranger lasted 18 months before requesting transfer. "Why?" I asked. "Didn't like the isolation," Kessler said. But his expression suggested there was more to the story. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Whatever reason kept other people away from that particular posting made it more attractive to me. I accepted the position on the spot. The cabin at Scotech Station was built in 1987, a prefabricated structure that had been reassembled in the clearing by the lake's north shore. It had 4 rooms, a main living area with a wood stove, a kitchen with propane appliances, a bedroom, and a storage room filled with equipment for fire management, water quality testing, and basic medical supplies. The furniture was institutional: a metal frame bed, a desk scarred with decades of ranger notes, 2 chairs that creaked with age. The lake itself was the real feature. Scotech Lake stretched nearly 2 miles across at its widest point, bordered by dense forest on all sides. The water was dark, not from pollution but from depth and the canopy of red spruce and hemlock that blocked the sky. In the evening the surface became almost black, reflective only as a mirror to the surrounding trees. I arrived in late April, when the forest was still deciding between brown and green. Kessler had driven me up personally, taking the service road that climbed from Bridgeton into terrain that grew progressively more remote. We'd passed 3 other service locations in the first 15 miles, but as we continued north, development vanished entirely. By the time we reached Scotech, we hadn't seen another person for over an hour. "Radio works on Channel 9, Kessler said, pulling equipment from the truck bed. "The repeater's on Blackthorn Ridge, about 8 miles northeast. You'll get clear signal from the cabin. Weekly check-in is Wednesday at 1800 hours. If something breaks, document it and we'll coordinate repairs when the supply truck comes through." He handed me a thick folder of maintenance logs and emergency procedures. "Rangers before you have kept detailed notes. Read them. They cover everything from equipment failure to wildlife behavior patterns." I carried the supplies inside while Kessler did a final walkthrough of the systems. The propane stove, the backup generator, the water filtration system that drew from the lake, the shortwave radio mounted on the kitchen wall. "You have any questions?" Kessler asked as he was leaving. "What made the last ranger leave?" I asked again. He was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the lake. The surface was calm, almost perfectly still. He said he heard things, didn't think the isolation agreed with him. Kessler turned back to me. "Some people aren't made for this kind of quiet. The mind can play tricks." "I'm not worried about tricks," I said. "Maybe you should be," Kessler said. But his tone was ambiguous. He could have been joking. He could have been warning me. He left before sunset, and I watched his truck disappear down the service road, until even the sound of the engine faded into the general quiet of the forest. Then I was alone in a way I'd never been alone before. There were no other voices within 10 miles. No lights except the ones I created. No sounds except those the forest produced. I spent the first night reading the previous ranger's logs. His name was Marcus Vale, and he'd kept meticulous records. The logs spanned 14 months, April to June of the previous year, and detailed everything from equipment repairs to animal sightings. Most of the entries were routine. A bear had damaged the trash containment in June. A section of fire detection cable had corroded and needed replacement. Water quality readings had remained stable, but there were other entries, scattered throughout the logs, always brief, sometimes cryptic. May 14. Heard something at the lake's edge around 22. Sounded like rhythmic, wet. Checked the perimeter. Nothing visible. Wind maybe. Wind through something wet. June 2. Found tracks near the northwest cove. Prints too large to classify. Possibly bear. Configuration unclear. Do not match normal ursine patterns. June 19. Hearing it more frequently now. Not always at night. Sometimes during the day, when I'm working on the North Ridge. Sounds like breathing, but not animal. The rhythm is wrong. Too deliberate. Need to review audio equipment. Might be malfunctioning. June 27. Submitted transfer request to Director Kessler. Personal reasons. Isolation not suitable for long-term assignment. Will remain through end of assignment term. July 8. I know what it is now. Found evidence near the eastern meadow. Remains of something large, partially consumed. The way the meat was taken, the precision of it. No animal I know hunts like that. The teeth marks. Christ. Request immediate transfer. This isn't isolation talking. This is something else. That was the last entry. The logs ended abruptly. A handwritten note on the final page stating that Marcus Vale had requested and received emergency transfer on July 10. I closed the folder and looked out the window toward the lake. Full dark had fallen completely. The water was invisible now, just a darker absence in the landscape. Somewhere out there, something moved through the forest, invisible but present in the way all living things are present when they share your space. I turned on every light in the cabin and tried not to think about what might live in an area remote enough to require a ranger at all. The first week was unremarkable. I fell into the rhythms of the job. Equipment checks, water sampling, perimeter walks. The cabin had no internet, so my evenings were spent reading the manual for the radio system, the fire management protocols, and every previous ranger's log going back to the station's establishment in 1987. I was building a picture of Scotech Station not as a place but as an organism with its own patterns and moods. Other rangers had reported wildlife encounters. There were the standard entries, black bears, white-tailed deer, elk, but there were also the anomalies. Sightings of creatures too large to be anything documented in the regional fauna surveys. Strange vocalizations. Tracks that didn't match any known species in the area. Most of these entries were written off as misidentifications, the product of isolation and imagination, but they were consistent across different rangers, different seasons, different years. By the end of my first week, I'd stopped questioning why Marcus Vale had left. By the middle of my second week, I understood completely. I first heard it on a Tuesday night, around midnight. I was reading in bed when the sound came through the walls, a kind of rhythmic knocking, methodical and insistent. I recognized it immediately from the logs. The breathing, the wet, sustained sound of something drawing air through a mechanism not quite designed for the purpose. I got up and went to the window. The clearing around the cabin was illuminated by the external floodlight, but beyond that pool of light, the forest was absolute darkness. The knocking continued, coming from somewhere toward the northeastern part of the property, near where the forest edge was closest to the cabin. I turned on the radio and checked the time. Too late to call Kessler, too isolated to do anything but wait it out. The sound stopped after about 20 minutes. I waited another hour before getting back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning I did a full perimeter sweep. The clearing around the cabin was undisturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest the source of the sound. But as I walked the perimeter, I noticed something. The forest seemed different on the northeast side. The undergrowth was flattened in places as if something large had been moving through repeatedly. The damage was old, at least several weeks or months, but it formed a path of sorts, a route that something used with regularity. I marked the location on my map and made a note in my own log. I tried to be clinical about it, like the previous rangers had tried, but my hands were shaking slightly when I wrote. Over the next 3 days, I heard the sound 3 more times, always in the same general location, always around midnight, give or take an hour. The knocking pattern remained consistent. 4 rapid beats, a pause of about 10 seconds, then 4 rapid beats again. It was almost rhythmic enough to be intentional, as if something was trying to communicate or signal. On Friday, I found the prints. I was walking the northwestern ridge trail when I came across them, and I immediately understood why Marcus had been unable to classify them. They were large, 14 inches in length at least, with a configuration that belonged to nothing in any wildlife manual I'd read. The gait was bipedal, which should have narrowed the possibilities severely. But the spacing was wrong, the weight distribution was wrong, and the depth of the impression suggested something weighing well over 300 pounds. What disturbed me most was what I found at the end of the trail, a dead deer, or what remained of one. It had been consumed, but not by any predator I could identify. The bones were split lengthwise, the marrow extracted with surgical precision. The meat was taken in specific sections, the musculature understood and removed with knowledge. A wolf would have consumed it differently. A bear would have been less methodical. This was intelligent, practiced. I photographed everything and filed the report via radio on Wednesday's check-in. Kessler listened to the description and was quiet for a long moment. Likely a large ursine, he said finally. Black bears in the region can exceed 300 pounds. The feeding pattern might reflect the individual's hunting strategy. The track pattern doesn't match any bear, I said. And the precision of the consumption is unusual. Document it and continue monitoring, Kessler said. That's what you're there for. But his voice had changed. There was something guarded in it now. Something that suggested he knew more than he was saying. That night, the knocking came again, but this time it was different. It didn't come from the northeastern perimeter, but from directly outside the cabin window, from the front porch where I kept the equipment maintenance kit. I looked out and saw nothing, but the sound continued. Not knocking now, but something more deliberate. Dragging, as if something was pulling itself along the wood planking. I grabbed the bear deterrent canister from the storage room and went to the door, rifle in my other hand. I'd been trained on it during orientation, a bolt-action .308, kept for protection against aggressive wildlife. My hands were steady now. Fear had given way to something more functional. I opened the door. The porch was empty. The sound stopped immediately, leaving only the normal sounds of the forest at night. The wind, the distant movement of nocturnal animals, the ever-present whisper of the lake water against the shore. I checked every corner of the clearing with the high-intensity flashlight. Nothing. No prints on the porch, no evidence that anything had been there at all. But the fear I felt was different now. It was specific. It was rational. Something was here. Something was actively investigating the cabin, and it was intelligent enough to stop when I appeared, to retreat rather than engage. That was when I understood what Marcus Vale had meant in his final log. This wasn't isolation talking. This was contact. By the 4th week, I'd stopped expecting the knocking to be explicable. I'd also stopped reporting the details to Kessler. He listened to my updates with patience but offered nothing beyond standard protocol. It became clear that he wasn't interested in the phenomenon. He was interested in whether I could manage it, whether I would stay, or whether I would join the list of rangers who'd left in the middle of their assignments. I decided to stay, not out of stubbornness, though there was some of that, but because something had shifted in me since arriving at Scotech Station. The disconnect I'd felt in my previous life, the sense of existing at a remove from reality, had inverted. Now I was more present than I'd ever been. Every sound meant something. Every shadow had weight. I started keeping more detailed logs, independent of the official records. I wanted to understand the pattern. When did the sounds come? How frequently? What seemed to trigger activity? I began to map the locations where I found evidence. More prints, more kill sites, the occasional sighting of something moving through the forest fast enough to blur, too large to be any standard predator. The evidence suggested a territory roughly 8 miles from the cabin, centered on a section of the forest to the northeast. The creature ranged widely, but it seemed to prefer certain areas: the eastern meadow, the northwestern ridge, a particular section of the lake's shore where the water was shallow and the rocks created a natural harbor of sorts. I also began to notice other things. The behavior of the normal wildlife changed when whatever this was came near. Elk herds shifted their grazing patterns. Deer avoided certain areas entirely. Even the birds seemed to know, falling silent in the hours before the creature moved through the forest. In my 3rd week, I found something that changed my understanding entirely. I was following a potential water source the creature seemed to favor. A spring-fed pool in the northeast section, when I came across what looked like a shelter. It was crude but deliberate. A depression in the hillside, covered with branches and layered with evergreen boughs. The area was worn smooth from repeated use, and inside, arranged with definite purpose, were items. Bones from multiple animals, some sharpened into tools. Strips of material I couldn't immediately identify. What looked like a deliberately constructed fire pit, though there was no evidence it had been used recently. This wasn't an animal's den, this was a camp. This was somewhere the creature lived, rested, possibly thought. I documented everything with photographs and a detailed description in my log. I didn't report it to Kessler. I wasn't ready to explain what I'd found, and I suspected Kessler wasn't ready to hear it explained. The separation between what Kessler would accept and what I now knew to be true had become too wide to bridge. That night, the knocking came again, but this time accompanied by something else. A vocalization. Not quite a roar, not quite a howl. Something that seemed to use human vocal mechanisms but produce sounds no human throat should create. It echoed off the lake water and the surrounding forest, and I realized with a clarity that went beyond conscious thought. It was trying to communicate, not aggressively, not a threat display. It was trying to speak. I went to the window and saw movement at the tree line, a shadow massive enough to block out the stars. I kept the rifle ready but didn't raise it. Some instinct told me this was not an attack. This was something else. The shadow moved slowly along the clearing's edge, and I heard the vocalizations again. Patterns, repetitions, the attempt at language. It sounded like something learning a new alphabet, testing the sounds, trying to remember the rules. It made my skin crawl because it was almost human, almost right, almost like listening to someone speak through a throat that had been reorganized wrong. It stayed for 20 minutes, circling the clearing. Then it withdrew, and I heard it moving back into the forest. I waited an hour before I lowered the rifle. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the desk and wrote in my personal log everything I'd witnessed since arriving at Scotech station. I was documenting something that had no official explanation, describing behavior from something that shouldn't exist. But as I wrote, the illogic of it became logic. The pattern became clear. The creature wasn't hunting me, it was studying me. It wanted to know what I was doing in its territory, and it was trying, in whatever way its biology allowed, to understand. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I would try to establish communication. I didn't expect success, but I had to try, if only to understand what was happening. I spent a week preparing. I learned everything I could about animal communication, not just vocalizations but scent marking, visual displays, behavioral patterns that might convey intent. I researched recordings of wildlife calls, studying the acoustic properties that seemed to trigger recognition and response. And then, on a Tuesday night, I walked to the creature's shelter and deliberately left something. A rabbit I'd hunted and prepared, and beside it a human artifact, my old wristwatch, the one I'd worn before coming to Scotech station. The watch wasn't valuable, it was symbolic. I was offering something from my world, something that would tell the creature I understood hierarchy and exchange. The next morning, the watch was gone. The rabbit had been consumed, though whether by the creature or by scavengers I couldn't determine. But it was the response I needed. Over the following week, I left other offerings, tools from the cabin, cloth items, eventually a carefully preserved piece of smoked fish I prepared myself. Each time the items disappeared, and each time the creature's activity around the cabin intensified. The vocalizations came earlier in the evening and lasted longer. The knocking became more insistent. It was as if my acknowledgement of its existence had given it permission to be more present. Then, on a Friday night, I received something in return. I found it on the porch in the morning. A fox skull, cleaned and polished, positioned carefully on the step. It was an offering, a response to my offerings. The creature was capable of intention. It was capable of symbolic exchange. It was, in whatever way such a thing could be true, reaching out. That afternoon I went back to the shelter with my radio. I set it to broadcast at low volume, letting the creature hear human speech, human frequencies. I left it there for hours before retrieving it, and that night, when the creature's vocalizations came, I responded. I broadcast back, using the radio to send my voice into the forest. Not words. The creature wouldn't understand words. Just sound, intent. A voice answering a voice, across the divide of species and whatever unknowable differences separated us. The creature fell silent. When it resumed, it was different. The vocalizations were closer in pitch to my own voice. It was trying to copy me, trying to meet me across that divide of biology. I spent that night crying, which surprised me. I didn't know what I was grieving exactly. My old life, perhaps, or the certainty I'd brought with me to Scotech station, the understanding that the world was what I'd been taught it was. The creature was teaching me different. By the end of my 4th week, I'd developed a pattern of communication. I would leave the cabin at specific times and go to the shelter. I would broadcast on the radio, speaking clearly, slowly, repeating sounds. The creature would listen, and then respond. It never showed itself, but I could hear it moving in the forest, could sense the presence of something enormous just beyond the tree line, and slowly I began to understand what it was. Not through words, but through observation. The precision of its hunting, the deliberate construction of its shelter, the objects it collected and arranged. These were signs of something that thought in long chains of causality, that understood consequence and planning. It was a mind vast and different from my own, but unmistakably a mind. I began to suspect what the previous rangers had missed, what Kessler had known or guessed but never confirmed. This creature was not an animal gone wrong or a cryptid escaped from folklore. It was a remnant, something that had always been in these forests, something that had learned to hide from humans, to avoid them when possible, to take only what it needed from a world increasingly hostile to its kind. And I, in my isolation and displacement, had stumbled into its territory. Instead of seeing me as a threat, it had recognized something in me. Another displaced thing, another being out of sync with the world beyond. In my 6th week at Scotech Station, I saw it. I was walking the eastern meadow in the early morning, when the light was still uncertain and the world seemed to exist in that space between night and day. The creature emerged from the forest's edge like a thought taking shape, moving slowly, deliberately, in a way that conveyed no aggression. It was unlike anything in any of the images I'd seen or imagined. Larger than a bear by at least a third, but the shape was wrong for any animal I'd ever encountered. The body was too angular, the limbs too long. The head was broad and heavy, the face a configuration of features that seemed to have been assembled from multiple species and arranged wrong. The eyes, when they caught mine, were intelligent beyond question. They held understanding. They held something that might have been loneliness. We stood perhaps 40 yards apart, neither moving. The creature did not crouch or show any predatory posture. It simply waited, as if asking a question without words. I lowered my rifle. I didn't lay it down, I couldn't do that, but I held it at rest, non-threatening. The creature made a low vocalization, one of the sounds I'd come to recognize as close to contentment. Then it spoke, not in words, in concepts that flooded into my mind with such clarity that it took me a moment to understand what was happening. The thoughts came in images and impressions and pure meaning. Hunger, yes, but also longing. The memory of a time before, when the forest had been less fragmented, when its kind had been many instead of one. Understanding that I was something different, something displaced from my own kind's centers, just as the creature was displaced from what might once have been a community of its kind. And then, most clearly, an offering. Safe passage. The creature would not hunt within a 5-mile radius of the cabin. In return, I would maintain the shelter, leave the offerings, keep the knowledge of its existence to myself. I understood, the way one understands in dreams, that this was not an agreement imposed by force but a genuine bargain. The creature wanted witness. It wanted proof that something intelligent still recognized it as intelligent, as valuable, as real. I nodded. The creature made the vocalization again and turned away, moving back into the forest with a gait that seemed almost human in its deliberation. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the shadows of the trees, and I was left alone in the meadow with the knowledge that I had just made a pact with something that had no name in any taxonomy I knew. I returned to the cabin and sat for hours, trying to process what had occurred. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. A dream, a hallucination brought on by isolation, a misidentification of a large bear. But I knew better. I'd experienced something real, something that existed in the world independent of my perception of it. That evening, I filed my monthly supply request with Kessler. I asked for specific items, bulk meat, preserved foods, items of minimal value that I could leave at the shelter. Kessler asked, in his careful way, what I was doing with the supplies. Extended foraging study, I said. Looking into the local wildlife population's food sources, he accepted the explanation without comment. Over the following weeks, a new pattern emerged at Scotech Station. I would find items the creature had left, more bones, more objects it had collected and arranged, sometimes objects from the cabin itself that had gone missing and reappeared at the shelter. It was engaging in exchange, in trade. It was learning the concept of value. I also noticed changes in the forest's behavior. The animals that had previously avoided certain areas began to return. The elk herds moved through the eastern meadow more frequently. The silence that had characterized the forest began to break more often into normal sounds. Birds, insects, the casual movement of wildlife. The creature was showing restraint. It was honoring the bargain, and I remained at Scotech Station when I could have requested transfer like all the others. I remained because I had something none of the previous rangers had, not fear, but understanding. The creature was not something to be overcome or reported to authorities who would come with weapons and nets and science they didn't understand. It was something to be coexisted with. One night, 6 weeks into my 2nd month, the creature's vocalizations became different. It was trying to approximate language again the way it had before, but now it was attempting specific sounds, approximations of human words, broken, distorted, but unmistakably attempts at English. Stay, it said, or something close to it. The word took on a shape in my mind that transcended language itself. Don't leave. Don't abandon this place. Don't return to the world beyond. I'm not leaving, I said aloud, though the creature couldn't hear me. But I said it into the radio before I could stop myself. And I heard the creature move in the forest, hear the satisfaction in the sounds it made. When dawn came, I was still at the window, watching the tree line. I thought about Kessler's question when I'd first accepted the job. Why do you want this? And I realized I finally had an answer. I wanted it because I'd been displaced from the world I'd known, and in this forest, in this remote station with its impossible inhabitant, I'd found another displaced thing. We fit together in the way broken things sometimes do, not perfectly, not in any conventional understanding of wholeness, but together in a way that mattered. The summer deepened, the forest grew thick with the abundance of the season, and I remained at Scotech Station, keeper of a secret that would sound impossible to anyone who heard it, documenting in my logs the routine of a park ranger in a remote posting while a far stranger documentation unfolded in the shelter at the edge of the civilization, the record of a creature learning human concepts of trade and language and coexistence. Sometimes, in the hours before dawn, I would hear it at the lake's edge, trying to sing. The sounds were rough and wrong, but they were attempts at something beyond pure survival. They were attempts at beauty, and that, I understood, was the final bridge between us, the recognition that existence could mean something more than simple persistence, that isolation could become companionship, that the unmapped spaces of the world still held mysteries, and some of them, if you were patient enough and broken enough and lost enough, might choose to share their strangeness with you. I signed my contract for a second season before the first season ended. Kessler accepted without comment, though I thought I saw something like satisfaction in his expression. I realized then that he'd suspected what would happen at Scotech Station, that he'd known the station required a specific kind of ranger, someone willing to redefine what rangership meant, someone willing to coexist with what couldn't be reconciled into the neat categories of established wildlife management. And as the summer gave way to autumn, and the first cold nights began to move through the mountains, I understood that I would stay at Scotech Station for far longer than the contract required. I had found not peace, that would have been impossible, but something more valuable. I had found a reason to stay present. I had found, in the most unexpected place, a form of belonging. The creature and I never became friends, not in any human understanding of friendship, but we became something, witnesses to each other's existence, proof that in a world of certainty and categories there were still spaces for the unmapped, the unclassified, the things that didn't fit. And sometimes, on nights when the silence was absolute and the lake reflected nothing, I would sit on the porch with my rifle beside me, not as a weapon but as a reminder of the boundary between my world and its world. And I would listen to the vocalizations from the forest, knowing that whatever was calling out was thinking of me, remembering me, maintaining the strange contract we'd made. I was no longer displaced. I was where I belonged.